Let's start webinar. Okay, let's, so participants are coming in. Okay, we'll wait for a bit longer. People are still coming in. For now, welcome to those of you who have joined us so far. Yeah, great to see people joining us from all over the place. Nice to have you here with us. Okay, what we should do is we'll start introducing our speakers while we wait for the people to arrive. So hello everyone, and welcome to our third session of this year's EUC Seminar Series, Aim High Degrow, Dialogues on Degrowth. If you might remember, our first session was an introduction to degrowth, followed by a fascinating discussion on feminism and decolonization, and in the context of degrowth. But if you missed any of those, you can catch up on the recordings and read summaries and resources on our website. So I invite you to go and check those. Today, we're going to delve into the implications of degrowth thought for cities and planning. We are very excited to have Jin Xue, who is a professor in urban and regional sustainability planning at the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. Jin's research interests are in urban and housing sustainable development, second home planning, degrowth and urban development and planning, urban futures based on scenario planning, and critical realism. We are also very excited to have Federico Savini, who is an associate professor in environmental planning, institutions, and politics at the University of Amsterdam. He studies the relation between planning and institutions from a degrowth perspective in order to find pathways to reduce the ecological footprint of urbanization on the planet. His recent publications include Post-Growth Planning, Cities Beyond the Market Economy, edited with Pereira and von Schoenfeld. This session will be moderated by my wonderful colleague, Luisa Sotomayor, who is an associate professor and also the director of the City Institute here at York University. Her research focuses on the various dimensions of urban inequality and their connections to governance and planning practice. A couple of reminders before I pass on to Luisa to kick off the session. The chat is open for comments and respectful dialogue. It's a good space for exchange there. However, if you have any questions, don't write your questions in the chat. For questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can click on the thumbs up to upvote questions that interest you, and that will help our moderator to prioritize during the discussion part. So please remember to use the Q&A button for questions rather than the chat. The session is being recorded and it will be available on our website afterwards. And like I said earlier, we're also collecting notes from the chat and the Q&A, and these will be posted on the website as well. Okay, let's get started. So over to you, Luisa.
Okay, good morning, everyone from Toronto. Good afternoon, good night from wherever you are watching us today. I would like to start with a land acknowledgement from York University. York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaronto or Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississauga of the Credit Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon, One Pond Belt Covenant or Agreement, which is an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. And if we think deeply about the meaning of the land acknowledgement and the topic of today, planning for degrowth, this is also an invitation to reflect on what the land acknowledgement means from wherever you are, if you're in a settler colonial situation, and connected to what planning can do, what research related to land and planning can do to take these land acknowledgements seriously. Okay, and with that, I would like to turn it over to Federico.
Yes, thank you, Luisa. Can you hear me well? Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yes, and you can see the screen as well. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So in the next 10 minutes, I will try to give some food for discussion and introduce the topic of the relation between degrowth, urbanization, and spatial planning. So I will just be able to introduce it, obviously, but hopefully it's enough to have a good discussion together with the next speaker as well. Now, you already have, so how do I do? Yes. You already had an introduction about degrowth and why it's important to think about degrowth. I'm not going to go into there. I assume that we kind of agree that the Degrow project is relevant to address the climate and biodiversity crisis, as well as the socioeconomic crisis in which we live. However, the question comes, how do we do that? And in my work, I try to place cities and urbanization at the center of the Degrowth project. Why I do so is because since the 70s, early 80s, we know, in fact, that the growth of national economies is generated within large urban agglomerations. In fact, already in the 87, John Logan and Moloch were talking about the so-called urban growth machine. Later on, many other scholars, urban intellectuals, they thought about the city as the birthplace of economic innovation. The idea that it's quite consolidated among urban policymakers that within cities we can actually generate the solutions for the social and ecological crisis in which we live. And therefore we need to invest there and maximize the generation of creativity, ideas, economic innovation cities. That's why cities, I think, are crucial for a Degrow project. This is what drives economic growth of nation states. In particular, within the globe, we have only a bunch of cities that are very, very important in the global economy. Only 600 cities cover 2/3 of the whole GDP of the planet. These cities, of course, include New York, Amsterdam, Beijing, and so on and so forth. Moreover, we know that because of this concentration of economic wealth in cities, cities are also machines of ecological destruction, at least the way they work today. In fact, even if urban areas cover only 2% of the planet's surface, they consume 75% of all materials and resources of the economy. So they are basically high concentration of ecological footprint. Finally, we know that cities are made of infrastructures and buildings, and infrastructure and buildings are one of the top 3 main investments in global capitalism today. So that's what drives the economy. Now, at the same time, talking about cities is important because the mainstream sustainability approaches that we use today to address social and ecological problems are highly insufficient to address this problem, or rather, they have quite big problems, they have quite big limitations. The three limitations, in summary, of the current mainstream sustainability approaches in urbanization and planning are, first of all, the fact that while cities might become more clean, less polluting, more circular, still this performance depends on the sacrificed zones of the globe where we extract the materials for the green economy, where we extract the cobalt for our batteries, where we extract the lithium for the electric vehicles of our cities, where we place solar panels and wind turbines, as well as coal and nuclear power plants for powering the energy demand of cities. The second problem is that the ecological footprint of cities is increasing, while cities might become more CO2 efficient or less polluting, or simply more green. We know, for example, that the extraction of lithium, which will increase 5 times in the next 10 years due to high demand of batteries, it's highly demanding in terms of land use. But the same works with also renewable energies, which I love. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're fundamental, but still the idea to transform the energy system into a sustainable one through renewables without thinking about degrowing or decreasing energy demand is wishful thinking. And finally, the third problem of current mainstream approaches is that they are highly dependent on the generation of capital, especially in real estate. So what we see is that the money that cities spends on ecological performance, they go in areas where people are already quite wealthy. They tend to actually reproduce patterns of discrimination by income, by race, by other forms, and generate or produce what we nowadays call low carbon gentrification. So these are three limits of mainstream sustainability, and this is why I think we need to think in terms of degrowth instead of just sustainability. Now, to introduce the term of degrowth, I would like to explain how cities grow. In order to explain how cities grow, I would like to use this graph. I'm going to drive you through this graph briefly in 3 minutes. So I hope you can follow my cursor here. So I hope to explain in doing this the relation between economic performance of cities and the ecological and social costs of this performance. And I do that in order to give some points of reference for a degrowth approach to urbanization that we can discuss later. Now, cities grow in the following way. If we take economic innovation here as the ultimate aim of policy making, which is one of the, let's say the fundamental premises of the hegemony of growth today, then we see that in cities, when we pursue economic innovation, we create what we call an obsolete urban fabric. All of a sudden, the city itself, the buildings, the infrastructures that we have in the city, they do not fit anymore the emergent economy. The emergent economy that could be, for example, a green economy or an electrification economy or an entertainment economy. I will give you a few examples. This obsolete production, so for example, underused buildings, calls for investment. Investment calls for debt. That is essential to drive economic growth in cities. The production of debt demands investment in the urban environment to cover that debt. That's what we call often renewal, so the reuse of infrastructure, or simply the demolishing of old infrastructure and the production of a new one. This renewal goes hand in hand in capitalism with displacement, a phenomenon that we call gentrification. So the production of new urban environments creates the displacements of the old function, and with that also the labor force and the social groups that were attached to that economy. This displacement demanded the urban expansion of new houses, new infrastructure, new mobility infrastructures that in fact drive more urban consumption. Urban consumption basically means more demand of technologies, more demand of materials, more demand of land, which in turn, of course, when you have more demand, here you go, you have the push to fulfill that demand in an efficient way, in an economically efficient way. And here you get the process of economic innovation again. However, this process that I just illustrated, in fact, has a quite strong relation with the environmental cost of urbanization. In fact, we see, for example, that increase of investment on the urban fabric demand more materials, raw materials, energy, and water. Of course, these materials increase the ecological footprint of the city, the amount of stuff that cities need to extract from sacrificed zones in the peripheries of the globe, even close by the way. Urban economic innovation and urban consumption always come with more waste. And this is simply the first law of thermodynamics. That basically more production generates pollution, generates heat residuals, generates waste water, waste materials. And of course, cities nowadays are very much trying to invest in a circular reuse of that waste in order to reduce the demand of raw materials. Now, this circular economy in cities is a way in which cities try to reduce the environmental impact of this innovation and displacement cycle. Now, this was quite a compact explanation, but I think it pinpoints at the fact that economic growth in cities is tied to this search for new investments, which leads to debt, which leads to displacement. And in capitalism, it's a very unjust and unequal process, which in turn also has ecological impact. One of the examples of this process, for example, is deindustrialization in the 80s, when cities in the global north have deindustrialized, and we had an abundance of obsolete urban fabrics, which attracted financial investments, which eventually turned into a vicious cycle that impacted on housing prices and displacement and so on and so forth. Now, there are ways to accelerate this process. So the economy, the growth economy, tends to accelerate this process because more investment, more debt, more urban consumption generates economic growth, generates urban regional GDP. And to do that, of course, cities have different ways to do that. But you could say that, for example, producing a highly specialized economy in a region could attract more investment. For example, the financial economy of London or Paris, or the chemistry economy of Cologne and Düsseldorf area. This is a way in which economic investments get channeled and somehow boosted within the cycle I just explained. The second, of course, is to privatize. Privatize urban space is a way to incentivize investments, is a way to actually quicken and fasten the process of GDP accumulation with all the kind of social costs that come with it. And finally, one way to accelerate is by simulating some sort of natural effect of this economic growth by painting buildings with green, putting biodiversity and birds on it, celebrating buildings to be highly sustainable. It's a way, in fact, in which we somehow lubricate this economic growth cycle by greening it to a certain degree. But the fundamental problem is the cycle itself, is not to what extent we have birds or trees on buildings. Okay. Now, in my work, I try to give an idea of how we can degrowth this process. And in the paper you see quoted here, which is a long paper, I'm going to just briefly introduce it. I give three examples of how we can rethink urbanization and this cycle of growth in terms of degrowth. And for me, the key words are three. The first one is to think in terms of autonomy of city regions. So in order to a certain degree, reduce the ecological footprint of this cycle of growth, we need to think about regions as self-sufficient spaces. Obviously, self-sufficiency, 100%, it's almost impossible to be reached, but that's not the issue. The issue is to try to make cities more rooted on the ecological regions in which they reside, and at the same time also make them more democratic, because in fact, with self-sufficiency comes also political autonomy. Okay, one way to make a space completely submissive to external powers is to make the space totally not self-sufficient. Just take Gaza today. Gaza is a not self-sufficient space. It's within the walls and within that walls has a complete lack of autonomy in the political sphere. So this is an example how sufficiency can also bring up political autonomy. Now, the second one is finity. So we need to look for a politics, an urban politics that deals with excess consumption and excess production, but by doing that also stimulates universal basic services in cities, in neighborhoods where these services are not available. And finally, we need to move towards a post-human approach to urban planning, where in fact we start to plan cities from the point of view of the ecosystem and not from the point of view of humans. Usually to people, provocatively, I say cities are dead zones. In the meaning, when I say they're dead zones, I mean in a city without nature, without biodiversity, with high pollution, no human being can survive if, you know, we take the human being as a body as an example. It's actually a highly stressful environment for the body. So we need to start thinking about cities as spaces where we regenerate the ecosystem, which means also we regenerate ourselves as human beings, because we are nature after all. Finally, I would like to give you 3 keywords on how to get there, because planning, after all, spatial planning is a discipline that tries to envision pathways to transformation. And to do that also tries to think how to organize that transformation, which is a very deep and radical transformation if we take degrowth seriously. Now, in a paper written by a colleague here at Maastricht University, Miriam Meisner, she actually points out that 3 key, not steps, but 3 key processes that lead to a possible degrowth transformation. And I think urban planning can learn from this. And she calls them prefiguration, popularization, and pressure. Prefiguration means to materialize the future in the city today, the degrowth future. So it means to stimulate experiments in a reduction of production and consumption that at the same time seek social justice. These are the many experiments of collective housing, cooperative housing, public transport, cycling, slow mobility, no mobility, or et cetera, et cetera. You have plenty of those. We can talk about this later. The second process is called popularization. So it means basically to organize the city as a space where we build this culture of degrowth. Basically, the challenge there is to let degrowth be a real project that people understand as, you know, positive for their own well-being, not an enemy. And this means to think in terms of policies that nudge a degrow urbanity. Think about campaigning, communication, but also strategic planning. I can talk more about that if you have questions about it. And the third, and this is very crucial, is pressure. So cities have been and are spaces for political mobilization. So the best thing that city can do to degrowth is to give space to those socio-ecological movements that basically puts bodies on the street to actually claim for a phasing out of environmentally destructive and socially exploitative forms of consumption and production, and a phase in for universal basic services. This is a call for mobilization, and cities, the center of power and economic power, are the spaces where this mobilization can be the most effective and, if not, also disruptive of the existing economic order that is growth dependent. So I think these are 3 keywords we can use to reflect about the process that leads to a possible degrowth form of urbanization. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you so much for such an informative presentation, Federico. I'm going to turn now the floor to Jin.
Yes, thank you, Federico. I think it's a very nice presentation, and I hope my presentation will give some complement elements about this topic. So I will keep also, probably like Federico, keep it a very general discussion, because I think urban degrowth and how planning should adapt or facilitate a degrowth transformation should largely consider the context. And also in my presentation, I will sometimes use post-growth as well, even though there are nuances in terms of the differences between them, but I use them most interchangeably in this presentation. So within this 10 minutes, I hope that I can go quickly through these 4 dimensions. First, very briefly about what is the ontological foundation for addressing planning and space generally in degrowth. And also I will move to a critique of the current urban development and planning paradigm. And after that I will talk about how we can urbanize degrowth, and also meanwhile we also need to degrow planning. So for a long time, especially in the beginning of the degrowth movements back to the 2008, 9, 10, I think there is this issue of space and planning was very much ignored. But I think it is super important to talk about space and planning. And that is primarily based on this dialectical relationship between the spatial and the social. Already as framed by this very famous researcher, Edward Sawyer, and he said that no social revolution can succeed without being at the same time a consciously spatial revolution. So I think urban planning, or generally spatial planning, actually intervenes the spatial development, and that also reacts back on the social. So if we consider degrowth as a kind of societal transformation that we need to achieve, then we definitely need to consider space, the role of space and planning in this picture. So when it comes to planning, I think both the strategic dimension of planning as well as the land use part of planning plays an important role. And also planning is a governmental approach, and it's the loci of power conflicts. And so therefore it plays this political, the role of this political dimension as well. And I think when we talk about space and planning, we also need to consider all those different scales from the national, regional, and also the city, the neighborhood scales. That's what I think is basically missing in the degrowth movement and debates now, or needs to be further highlighted. Also, all different types of planning, strategic planning, land use planning, or zoning plan, or detailed plan, all this planning has a very big potentials for degrowth. If we look at the current planning system or planning paradigm, I think there is no doubt that this planning is so much used to a growth idea. The very origin of planning is actually to deal with the negative consequences of a growing economy and society. So therefore, planning has been in the history very much based on the idea of a growing population size, and we need to accommodate this population by building more, by building infrastructures, and we also planning to accommodate or boost economic growth. And there are also related growth or growth-related rationality that is very much taken for granted in planning. For example, we need to increase our material living standards. We should always have higher mobility and so on. So therefore, planning is oriented towards a growth ideology, and so it's very hard for planning to think about even stagnation or steady state, not even to mention degrowth. And all the institutional frameworks around planning, as well as the ideology of planning, is not ready to actually pursue a degrowth or post-growth future. And to be more specifically, actually, we can find very concretized green growth ideologies in the current planning. For example, the compatibility discourse, that's the most common one. Planning aims to pursue economic growth and at the same time try to reduce the impacts, the negative impacts from this growth by, for example, increasing the land use efficiency and such kind of solutions. There is also this prerequisite discourse, which is based on this environmental closeness curve, which says that if we want to reduce the pace of environment degradation, we need to become rich first. And also more recently, this green fix or sustainability fix idea in planning, which tries to combine a growth idea with a sustainability. And also being green and being sustainable is something that can make the cities more competitive. And it therefore becomes a solution, a fix to the economic problems. A very typical case is Malmö from Sweden. So here, for example, this quote from the Eco Metropolis Planning of Copenhagen, which basically says that being green growth is something that we need to compete for. And of course, this planning paradigm, or eco-modernist planning paradigm, has been heavily criticized for its failures in both social justice and also environmental sustainability. So that indicates a change, a need for a change. And meanwhile, I think we have to be aware that probably in the future, stagnation will be the new normal condition. So we can't have 10%, 5% economic growth all the time. And also the same applies to the population. So therefore planning needs to be ready to adapt to this new condition in the future. If we are going to talk about urban degrowth, then first I think we need to clarify what degrowth means, because there are many different definitions and also researchers have different take on that. For me, I think degrowth is composed of these three important blocks. First, affinity. This is also mentioned by Federico, for me, it's the very basic foundation of degrowth, that we need to acknowledge or respect the boundaries of our planet. And that means we need to downscale the level of production and consumption. In the urban context, it's about to downscale the housing consumption, the land use, also the resources that we use in our urban life. And also justice, which is the ethical premise, and here it means justice in a broad sense across space, time, and species. And there are also implications for this. To achieve justice within limits means redistribution, and that's very, very challenging for planning, because planning has never tried to kind of achieve equity when we can't have a growing society. So that's very challenging and needs to be innovative. And the last dimension is about the quality of life, which is more about the non-materialistic dimension. And this has to be achieved through a democratic process. So to bring degrowth to the urban, therefore, means that to translate these three degrowth principles to the urban sphere. And for example, to downscale the economy, the Urban Critical Series has already illustrated that how urban spatial development and planning has played an essential role in perpetuating, expanding, and saving the capitalist mode of production and consumption. So actually, we should reverse this process, and planning should therefore try to facilitate, for example, local economy, enhance the resilience of economic system, and so on, instead of to facilitating the capitalist accumulation. And also save the environment. This is not new in planning, and there has been many land use strategies to deal with the environmental issues. But what is new, I think, in urban degrowth is that we should address sufficiency in addition to efficiency. And that means we could cap land use for urban development. We could cap household consumption of residential spaces and travel volume, for example. And also, as I said, that to redistribute within limits is rather challenging. And for planning, I think we need a multi-scalar strategy and also a certain level of power centralization. This we could, of course, discuss later on. And so based on that, I think Degrow's grounds for planning should look at the outcome dimension, but also the process dimension. Well, I would say perhaps the most famous planning theories in the past have been very much focused on the process and neglect the outcome dimension. But I think for Degrowth, which is a normative project, the outcome dimension should be very much emphasized in planning. So if I can define a Degrowth planning, I mean it counters the hegemony of economic growth and facilitates a downscaling of urban physical development that enhances ecological conditions, satisfy basic needs, and secures justice at the local and global level in the short and long run. And also, this should take place on the ideology side, on the normative side, and the utopianism. So this, I don't have time to elaborate on that, but we can also follow that in the discussion. So, but meanwhile, I want to mention that planning, of course, has potentials, but planning is also conditioned and constrained by the larger societal conditions. So why we are so addicted to growth is very much about the economic structures. And also planning is largely shaped by the dominant political ideology. And so how planning could resist to this political ideology is something that's interesting to discuss for discussion. And also planning is usually in many countries are just administrative, given professional inputs and do not have the power to make decisions. So there are limitations with planning in this larger political landscape. And also planners who are pro-degrowth could also stand in a conflict with the larger citizens who do not want to have degrowth. So therefore, these dilemmas, ethical dilemmas that planners need to deal with. And also in this neoliberal conditions, usually the local authorities do not have so much power in front of the developers, the global capital, and so on. Yes, I hope I managed to keep the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jin, for a fantastic presentation. I'm going to start now facilitating the conversation, but since I'm the moderating today, I'm going to just ask my question and then go to questions from the Q&A chat. So one of the main concerns of many planners who work actively in facilitating development on their everyday, that's what they do. They approve development applications and they're promoting and facilitating urban development, right? Housing. In the current moment in Canada, there's a very pervasive discourse about the need for a large-scale housing supply, facilitate development as the key issue and political issue. What are some alternative ways to think about the housing crisis, considering that this is not only in Canada, but it's a global issue? And I'm wondering what strategies can be used to think about the provision, the equitable, affordable provision of housing under the growth framework.
We should go first, Luisa.
Sorry, yeah, for both of you, who would like to start? Who would like to comment on?
Should I comment, Jin? Is that okay for you?
Yeah, just go ahead, Federico.
Okay, thank you. Yes, housing is an essential need. So if we take that as a fact, then all of a sudden we open all kinds of possibilities about A, producing housing, for those people who don't have it, but also redistributing housing space. And I think a Degrow perspective on housing is not a perspective that makes building new houses impossible, even though we should build them in a way that is ecologically and very efficient as much as possible in terms of land use. Okay, but that's not the issue. I think the issue is the redistribution of an asset, basically, that has been in the last 30 years privatized, commodified, and accumulated by few single, companies, groups, investments, trust that dominate the housing market in many of the global cities in which we live. And that is the housing justice justification for degrowth. So there, the issue is basically to redistribute and to actually use housing for what it is, which is an essential need and not an asset for investment. So I would put, in fact, caps. I would actually do what they are trying to do in Berlin, to expropriate developers that have excessive amount of houses. And of course, if you are a planner, I would start thinking in terms of all kind of regulations that deal with rents, deal with the multiple home ownership, that deal with taxation of underuse of housing space in order to disincentivize it. And of course, obviously, also consider the production of new housing. But the production of new housing, as we know by economics, is not the solution to the housing crisis. You can produce new houses and then let them vacant as investment assets, and that's what's happening in many cities. So this would be for me the way to tackle housing from a Degrow perspective.
Thank you. Jin, would you like to add?
Yeah, I share many of the points that were mentioned by Federico. I think here in Norway, in Oslo especially, the capital city, we experience same challenges now. There's a lot, or claimed a large shortage of housing. And usually the housing developers, they blame the city planners for not allocating enough land for housing, and also they blame the planning for taking too long process in the planning of housing. So but I think the problem is actually we all try to use the market mechanisms to solve this problem. And also this housing shortage problem comes along with very high housing prices. And many people have this affordability issue. Well, I think many of these old actually schemes or housing policies, at least that were practiced in Norway before the 1980s, when the housing market is completely privatized and marketized, there is a lot of, I think, non-market interventions. For example, the municipal has land and then it can be sold to the developers long below the market land price. And there is also price regulations and rental regulations. And also, I think measures such as to diversify the housing tenure and also to develop a large part of social housing. And also the changes in the law, for example, to give the planners or to give the municipalities the power to buy a part of the housing in a new housing project below the market price and so on. And also have targeted measures for different social groups, for example, students who actually needs dwellings. So those are, I think, the measures that can be considered. But meanwhile, I think for degrowth, we first should evaluate whether we need to build new houses. If we look at the per capita housing consumption, I think including Canada and also Oslo, the per capita housing consumption is actually very high, over 50 square meters. So I think it's therefore, if we talk about degrowth, which we try to avoid building new and more, we need to look at within the current housing volume, stock volume, how we redistribute. It's still a lot of spacious villas here that is only only one family of 3 or 4 that use. So probably this is the houses that need to be redesigned and shared by more than one families.
Well, thank you both. I will just add that there is also a need to defend existing forms of housing, because it seems nobody's defending the existing infrastructure, and there seems like a never-ending drive for new development, right? We have a number of interesting questions related to existing policies, and basically I see that some of our guests would like to know like the specifics, like how can we materialize, materialize this imagination of degrowth through policies? Are there any degrowth cities? Are there specific policies that are now enacting the practice of degrowth through planning?
Should I go, Luisa? Maybe.
Yes, please go, Federico.
Okay. No, degrowth in cities doesn't exist, unfortunately. We don't have a degrowth city, so we don't have that as a coherent project. Let's put it this way. But what I try to explain in my presentation, in order to trigger this deep transformation of degrowth, and to trigger a new ideology, a new radical ideology of degrowth, we need to start from where there are the seeds, where the future is already performed. So the cities, I think, not exclusively, but primarily, are places where we find a lot of practices that tries actively to do 2 things: to actually reduce consumption and production by all kind of forms of solidarity economies, sharing, caring for each other, etc., and at the same time achieve social justice by providing essential services like food, like healthy food, and in fact housing as well. Okay, so we need to start there. We need to go from there in order to build a degrowth movement that can pressure institutions. So when I think this is the only way to do it, because asking the state to degrowth cities, they will say you're crazy. That's no reason for me to do it. The reason is in the people who perform it already, and that's I think prefiguration is essential. On the other hand, we do need to create a conversation between prefiguration and the state. We need this pressure process, because we cannot imagine a voluntary degrowth community alone to actually trigger this radical transformation. That's I would say how we can start. And I can give you a huge list of practices that relate to degrowth everywhere, from Amsterdam to any other city, and there are.
Thank you. Jin, would you like to add?
Yeah, I agree with Federico. I don't think you can find a city that can be said to be a degrowth city, but there are many small-scale urban practices that maybe can be considered as degrowth projects, at least sharing degrowth principles and values. But usually like urban gardening or co-housing projects and so on. But usually I'm a bit skeptical about those practices, because as I said, I think it's important first to think about whether we really need, for example, to build so many houses. So even though you can build the co-houses in a very very socially friendly way and so on, but or you sharing some justice or caring, those values that in degrowth, but still probably the starting point is wrong. So therefore I do think this practice are good, but I think they should consider this larger spatial scale dimensions as well. And I sometimes also, I think in planning, there comes new concepts and innovations that probably can be considered as degrowth, but they're not framed in this way. For example, currently in Norway, this concept of area neutrality which means that we want to have zero loss of nature in urban development, could also be considered as a degrowth strategy that aims to actually stop taking more nature in urban development and also to restore the destroyed nature. But I think but how this is practiced, whether it functions as a green version, is an open question. So I think here the researchers, or the task of researchers, is try to understand how this kind of degrowth ideas is actually taken up and is happening in planning, and also at the same time discuss what are the conditions that are needed to make it a real degrowth planning strategy. But not be co-opted by the neoliberal politics.
Right, thank you. So I think some of the points that you just raised brings us to talk about the governance aspects, right? There are questions about the limited capacities of cities, even if there's political will and political leadership, they are still limited by their fiscal, administrative, governance capacities. So this degrowth goes with a call for some sort of devolution of power to the city, like new decentralization, or debates about new translocal movements that could promote degrowth to trans-city diplomacy or things like that. So, okay, Federico again.
Okay, thank you. So if we take the idea of the state, I mean, people tend to think, okay, there is a national government and then there are cities. Well, actually, if you take, let's say, Europe, we see there is a national government, but the national governments, what are them? If you look at how they are territorially organized, they are organized into mostly small, medium network of cities. Cities are what makes the public constituency of national government in urbanized or areas of what we call early urbanization, okay? So there we might say, okay, cities do not have the regulatory jurisdiction to trigger degrowth straightforwardly, okay, tomorrow. That's understandable. But if you look at the political process that changes the ideologies and the institution of national government, we see that the process that you defined as governance is a process that it's multi-layered. It works as a continuous negotiation and communication between cities and regions in Europe and national governments. So if we look, for example, at the European Union, how the subsidies goes around, I mean, the European Union spend a lot of subsidies to sustain what they call as poorer towns of the regions, you know, and these are cohesion subsidies. They are lots of money. How they are directed? They are directed talking to regions that are poor, not to nation state primarily. So, in fact, the regions where these cities suffer are the primary interlocutors of the European Union. So, in fact, what we see now in Europe is that there is a tension between these regions of shrinkage, of economic distress and tension, and large cities that do grow, in fact. So, in fact, when I talk about nation states, I always try to define it in this way, because the nation state is not one monolithic single government body. It is actually the negotiation behind these policies are built on the ground, and on the ground is where the public opinion is shaped. So I think we should revalue the potential that cities have for this political transition. But it's true that jurisdictionally or legally at the moment, cities do not have such a huge power to have those radical phasing out of major infrastructures, even though they do have some, especially some cities with big harbors, big airports, you know, they have quite some power. But yeah, that's a bit how I see it.
Thank you. Jin, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think maybe add with a very concrete example, because I think we need a power shift, and the most maybe the most functional thing is to have this local movement as framed by the pressure strategy in Federico's presentation. A very concrete example that is happening in Norway is that many municipalities, they want to build the second homes, the holiday homes, because it becomes a source of economic growth and job places in the local areas. But more recently, there has been a strong local protest. That it's happening in several of these cabin or second home municipalities. And people want to stop new development of the cabins. And this has led to changes in the land use plan. So I think those local movements and the protests is quite important. And you can't just wait for the national politicians to develop this political willingness to pursue degrowth. And I think this bottom-up movement is quite important and necessary to achieve degrowth.
Thank you, Jin. There's a number of questions here that relate a bit to this bottom-up movement that you're mentioning, but that also touch on indigenous knowledge ideas that resonate with degrowth, ideas emerging from the Latin American context. If I think about buen vivir in Colombia, living well together, and there's a lot of potential in terms of popular education, right? Like these tools, popular education since the 60s and 70s that have had a very strong impact on social justice education. And what are the possibilities, the examples, the opportunities to build like beyond what may be taken as more Eurocentric knowledge production on degrowth and bridging it with what's happening in the global South, in indigenous nation spaces, and how do we build up a more global movement? And I think that's going to be the last question, right, Lina? Okay, so Jin, would you like to just reply to that, and then Federico to change a little bit?
Yeah, so if I understand it correctly, you mean the indigenous knowledge or which can provide inspirations for degrowth. Or maybe I misunderstood, sorry.
Yeah, no, so what I'm referring to is that many of the concepts that you have very clearly explained today are also, they also evoke some ideas of living well together in indigenous knowledge frameworks, but also resemble buen vivir, like living well together, all these other ideas of well-being that come from other contexts in the global South. So in a sense, for many people, this may not be as new if they perceive it from a perspective of the indigenous living well together framework. So I'm wondering if there's any opportunities to sort of build together this movement by enacting a more global approach, dialogue with what's happening in the global South through this indigenous knowledge, or basically what are the opportunities for this popularization that you've talked about, bottom up, to build on what's like the history of popular education and the traditions and the popular power as has been built through decades, right, for other purposes related to social justice?
Yeah. Yes, I think this is, of course, a very broad question, not only about urban issues or planning issues. Well, I think, at least I think in the last year's Degrowth, International Degrowth Conference, we see a lot of focus on the global loss and on the global South and the ideas and the concepts that are coming from there. And I think this dialogue between the North and the South has been strengthened, at least in the last year's Degrowth Conference. And I think those kind of platforms is quite important to build up this mutual understanding and to develop alternatives. And sometimes I think degrowth is not about inventing new strategies and ideas, but actually to listen to these alternative cultures or living experiences of people from other regions and parts of the world. And I think also the international platform is quite important to develop this kind of collaboration. Also in research, for example, when we talk about justice across space, but how is that actually can be involved or embedded in a city planning, right? When we build a house, when we decide our urban development, how this justice perspective can be incorporated. So we also, for example, have research that exploring these dimensions, and also I think all of these contribute to this collaboration and integration.
Thank you, Federico. You have 1 or 2 minutes because we are now at time, but please feel free to.
Okay, it's okay. I can stay a bit more if you need, but it's no problem. I will be brief. When we think, I mean, of course, indigenous knowledge is essential for a Degrow project because finally we can break this anthropocentric, Western-centric and patriarchal approach that is at the foundation of the growth institutions in planning as well. And so when I talk about indigenous knowledge in planning, I focus particularly on the way indigenous land is managed. What we see is that the Western-centric approach to planning, and in particular to land use or to zoning, is a strongly market-based and strongly human-based. It's all about making sure that the real estate doesn't lose value and to make sure also that the functions on that piece of land are functional for the human usage. It's a problem for our planning system today. So looking at how indigenous communities manage land in the forms of common property rights, community-based government models, subsidiary, collective-based forms of decision-making, it's very inspiring also for what we might define as global north. It is also in the global north we try to experiment with community land trust, for example. And community land trust is just another, legal term to create a tool that is inspired by, common land stewardship in indigenous communities as well. There are connections there. So that would be my view on this dialogue between indigenous planning and Western-centric planning.
So much more to say. Thank you so much, Federico and Jin. This has been fantastic, and I think, I wish we had more time to keep talking about. Some of the questions are fantastic also in the Q&A box, but I'm gonna give it back to Lina.
Yeah, thank you, Luisa. Thank you for moderating and going through all the questions. I know Federico and Jin could stay a few more minutes, so I'm wondering if you want to spend like 1 minute each giving us, something that you wanted to say and you didn't have a time, or looking through the questions, was there something you wanted to, to answer in terms of that? Just kind of an opportunity to close with whatever, we didn't get a chance to cover. But hopefully this conversation will continue through the website, through the YouTube videos, and so on. People joining the different groups and resources that have been shared in the chat. So yeah, just to finish up, do you want to just?
Well, I just to finish up in 1 minute is difficult, but I saw the questions briefly, and there was one that was voted a lot about the donut model, and it's something that comes up often when we talk about Amsterdam. Yes, it has been co-opted, and I think the problem there was that, just briefly, is that it was very much top-down led. So it was led by the elder woman at the time of spatial planning and sustainability, and it was done through paying an agency, which was, of course, also related to Kate Raworth, that would establish a process of city portrait. And Then they try to connect it to local practices. So the ownership of the process was not grassroots. The ownership of the process was institutional. And I think that is one of the explanation of why, as soon as the elder man changed, now we have a new elder man, the whole thing got a bit less visibility, even though it's still existing. And then there was a question about the 15-minute city, which I know it's debated a lot in North America. The 15-minute city is great. I mean, if you take it as the justification of universal basic services accessible at the level of neighborhood, then it is a great idea. Obviously, if we take universal basic services, accessibility point of view, degrowth demands this accessibility. You should not commute an hour to go to basic school. You should not commute an hour to get medicines. So this is a way, in fact, we can think about the spatial distribution of land uses in a degrowth city. I think 15 minutes could be a good orientation. Of course, can be 20, can be 17. I mean, apart from the slogan. And finally, if I can, if you want more of research on this topic, you can visit the Post-Growth Cities Coalition website, where also Jin is part of. It's a website that we set up to just collect all this research on urban degrowth. Yeah, there you find the material. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very good, Jin.
Yeah. I want to quickly comment on this 15 minutes city, because I think there are potentials. And of course, degrowth is also about to localize your activities. So proximity is a very important word here. But meanwhile, if we look at the current land use, or because of the highly specialized labor market and also the education and so on, the expertise people have, actually, it's very hard to locate the workplaces to be within your 15 minutes circle. So it's relatively easy to have 15 minutes city in non-work places functions. But when it comes to the workplaces, usually you have to commute, and that's a long distance, and that's actually usually takes the majority of your stands for a large part of the travel volume. So therefore, that means that it's not only the physical setting that is important, it's also about how our economy is structured, makes this long distance travel a necessity. So therefore, we should relate this urban planning concepts with the larger societal and economic and also political conditions to understand whether it is we actually achieve degrowth or not. And another dimension, a more general point I want to address, maybe it's also something that really concerns me recently, is that we have a lot of theoretical discussions about urban degrowth and what urban degrowth, urban planning should be. But I feel a kind of split, a separation between the theoretical discussions in academia and the practice. So I'm quite concerned about how we can really bring these degrowth ideas to the practice and to really influence and shape planning practice that can contribute to the degrowth transformation.
Great. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for your time and everyone who joined us today. And yeah, remember to sign up for our upcoming seminars. We're halfway through, and yeah, see you next time. Have a good rest of your day.